Clouds press low over the Pyrenees, brushing the jagged peaks like ancient spirits. In the silence between mountains, only the wind remembers what the world once was. Here, at the edge of northern Spain and southwestern France, a people live whose very existence defies the arc of European history. While the rest of the continent bent under the weight of empire, conquest, and conversion, the Basque stood still, not in defiance, but in endurance. Civilizations came like waves. The Romans paved roads across Britain, built cities in Gaul, and wrapped the Mediterranean in Latin. The Moors crossed the Strait and lit Iberia with science and steel. Even language spread like wildfire, reshaping the tongues of Celts and Slavs alike into the rhythm of Indo-European syllables. But here, tucked in this rugged corner of the world, one culture did not move. Its language remained a mystery, its blood untouched, its customs echoed in stone and silence. To walk the Basque country is to walk a contradiction, surrounded by Spanish flags and French signs, yet hearing a language that belongs to neither. Euskara is not a dialect. It is an orphan, a linguistic fossil with no known ancestor, no cousin, no path to follow. It has no Indo-European roots. It shares nothing with Latin, Greek, or Celtic. It simply remains. And in that quiet resistance, it reveals the heart of the Basque mystery. Why did this language survive when others died? Why does the DNA of this small population show patterns seen nowhere else in Europe? And how did a people manage to preserve themselves, not behind walls of empire, but in the folds of geography, in the rhythms of rural life, and in the stubborn persistence of memory? The Basques did not insulate themselves with armies. They didn't expand, or conquer, or evangelize. They endured. Their valleys were steep, their rivers fierce, their borders blurred not by lines, but by hills and snow. To outsiders, their land was an obstacle. To them, it was sanctuary. Generations passed. Empires rose and fell beyond the mountains, but the Basques were already home, and they stayed. Their story does not begin with conquest. It begins with silence, with the sound of footsteps in mountain fog, with children learning words no invader could translate, with bloodlines passed from father to son, mother to daughter, unbroken not by might, but by choice. Because in this land, time didn't freeze. It flowed differently, slower, deeper, hidden from the noise of history. And so we begin not with a revolution, but with a refusal, not to change, but to forget. Long before the first pyramid touched the sky, before Latin echoed through marble forums, before even the wheel rolled across Mesopotamia, the bones of Europe lay buried beneath an ocean of ice. Glaciers swept across the northern continent, swallowing forests, drowning rivers, and pushing life to the brink. In that frozen silence, a few places held on, and one of them was here. The Franco-Cantabrian region, a stretch of sheltering caves, steep valleys, and cold mountain winds, became the last redoubt of Europe's earliest survivors. For tens of thousands of years, as mammoths thundered and snow choked the sky, small bands of humans gathered around fires inside limestone chambers. They carved their memories into rock. They passed on the blood of those who came before. In this ancient refuge, the ancestors of the Basques were not just surviving. They were becoming something singular. Recent genetic studies shine a light into the deepest shadows of prehistory. Mitochondrial lineages unique to the Basque population, subclades of haplogroup H, trace their divergence back over 8,000 years. These aren't generic European signatures. They are whispers from mothers who lived in this exact land during the tail end of the Ice Age. Not imported, not diluted, not erased. But DNA is only part of the trail. Archaeology adds its voice. Atapuerca, a mountain ridge in northern Spain, is more than a site. It's a timeline carved into the earth. Layers of stone have yielded skulls, tools, and secrets going back over 1 million years. Yet the ones that matter most to the Basque story come from the Upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic, moments where the continuity of habitation becomes undeniable. This wasn't a place people stumbled into. It was a home they refused to leave. While other parts of Europe emptied and refilled with each climatic pulse, this region held firm. Culture layered on culture, memory embedded in soil. The same valleys that echo with Euskara today once heard languages long vanished, but perhaps not entirely lost, because something remained: a rhythm in the genetics, a pattern in the artifacts, a silence in the stone that speaks continuity. The Basques do not stand apart from Europe's deep past. They are its preserved core, not an exception to the continent's story, but a chapter untouched by later edits. Their Ice Age ancestors didn't just live here. They endured long enough to pass something forward, through blood, through custom, through something as fragile as language and as indestructible as identity. And as the glaciers receded and new peoples flowed into the continent, these mountain dwellers did something extraordinary. They stayed. Roughly 7,000 years ago, a quiet revolution swept across Europe. But it wasn't carried by swords or ships. It moved with seeds. From the sunlit hills of the Near East, the first farmers began their long march westward, carrying grain, livestock, and a way of life that would redefine the continent forever. As these early agriculturalists crossed into Iberia, they encountered a land shaped by deep time, forests that had never been cut, rivers that remembered the Ice Age, and small bands of hunter-gatherers who had never seen a plow. And among those people were the distant ancestors of the Basques. What happened next was not a replacement. It was a merging. Ancient genomes pulled from burial sites in northern Spain reveal a genetic interweaving. Incoming farmers mixed with local foragers. This was not a conquest of genes, but a convergence of histories. Two populations, one rooted in deep Paleolithic survival, the other born from the Neolithic pulse, met and fused in the valleys of what would one day be called Euskalharia. This hybrid ancestry became the foundation of the Basque genome. And then, something rare occurred. The genetic mixing stopped. Unlike in other parts of Iberia, where new waves of migration layered DNA like sediment in a riverbed, the Basque population began to seal itself off. The blend of lineages, Mesolithic and Neolithic, that formed the Basque genetic identity was locked in place, like amber holding a moment in time. Evidence from the El Portolan cave system makes this stunningly clear. Bones buried over 5,000 years ago contain DNA that aligns more closely with today's Basques than with their modern neighbors. These are not faint echoes. They are living signatures. It's as if time tilted here, not frozen, but filtered. While Europe's great genetic churn continued, with Bronze Age pastoralists bringing steppe ancestry, with Roman legions leaving their imprint, with later Islamic rule blending North African and Levantine genes into Iberia, the Basque genome barely flinched. This was the final mix, and it endured. Modern analyses confirm that the Basques carry an unusually high percentage of early European farmer ancestry, paired with a stubborn trace of Western hunter-gatherer heritage. That ratio, roughly 80-20, is a fingerprint that distinguishes them not by foreign origin, but by historical insulation. But why here? Why this valley, these mountains, this people? Because farming didn't just reshape the land. It shaped how humans formed communities, chose partners, told stories. And in the Basque Highlands, those stories stayed local. Traditions rooted in land ownership, kinship farming, and seasonal rituals built invisible walls around these early settlements. Over generations, those walls became cultural and genetic. This isn't a tale of isolation imposed. It's one chosen, then repeated, then remembered. The Basques didn't resist change by accident. They inherited a fusion, then preserved it so completely. It became a living artifact of prehistoric Europe, a region where farming and foraging didn't erase each other, but united into something quietly extraordinary. And even now, when we sample their DNA, that moment still breathes. Around 2,500 years before our era, a deep transformation was reshaping Europe. Iron replaced bronze. New burial rites, new weaponry, and new hierarchies began to ripple across the continent. From the steppes of the East to the shores of the Atlantic, people were on the move. But not everywhere. In the mountains where northern Spain and southwestern France meet, something remarkable began, or rather, refused to begin. Here, the people who would later be called the Basques entered the Iron Age not with expansion, but with entrenchment. As tribal alliances shifted across Iberia and Indo-European tongues spread like wildfire, the Basque valleys turned inward. And from that moment on, the genetic clock slowed to a crawl. When modern researchers examined ancient remains from across the Iberian Peninsula, They found unmistakable signs of change. Gene flow from the Eurasian steppe, influence from Mediterranean traders, and later, unmistakable traces of Rome and North Africa. But in Basque territory, those layers never arrived. DNA from Iron Age skeletons aligns so closely with the genes of living Basques today that it's as if the centuries in between barely mattered. These are not fossilized remnants of some long-lost people. These are direct descendants, uninterrupted, unabsorbed, undiluted. While empires were mapping the world with roads and colonies, the Basque genome stayed local. This was not genetic stagnation. It was intentional continuity. There's no evidence of large-scale migrations into the Basque homeland after the Iron Age. No markers of Roman soldiers settling. No signatures of North African admixture during the Islamic period. No detectable impact from the Visigothic waves that altered so much of Spain's genetic landscape. Instead, what you see is isolation crystallized in biology. But this wasn't a land locked in fear. It was a land where connection meant kinship, not conquest. Communities were bound by language, custom, and proximity, not by external rule. Political boundaries came and went, but the valleys remained quietly resistant. Linguists and geneticists now know that even neighboring towns within Basque country often married internally for generations, leading to subtle genetic differences across just a few kilometers. And yet, across the entire region, the deeper pattern holds. No outside admixture, no cultural erasure, no collapse of continuity. While the rest of Europe evolved through replacement, the Basques adapted through endurance. The Iron Age didn't pass them by. It passed through them, without disruption. And in that rare stillness, a genetic legacy was preserved like pressed leaves in a forgotten book. The Basques didn't stop changing because they were left behind. They paused because their foundations were strong enough not to fall. In the story of European ancestry, the Basques don't represent an ancient mystery. They represent the silence between invasions, the stability between storms. The genome doesn't forget. It records. It remembers migrations, betrayals, famines, loves, and lineages, not with ink, but with molecular traces. And when scientists sequenced the DNA of the Basque people, they didn't just find ancestry. They found silence. And that silence spoke louder than noise. No population in Western Europe has resisted genetic blending as stubbornly as the Basques. Their DNA holds echoes of Europe's earliest transformations, but stops short of every storm that followed. The data doesn't lie, it isolates. Start with the paternal line, the Y chromosome. In Basque men, one branch dominates like nowhere else, R1b, DF27. It's not just common, it's overwhelming. Nearly 70% of Basque men carry it. That's not normal diversity. That's a founder effect carved into a people. What's more revealing is how narrow the range is. The diversity within this lineage is low, meaning it likely expanded from a small group, around 4,000 years ago, and stayed local ever since. Elsewhere in Iberia, the same haplogroup exists, but it's diluted by layers of later admixture. In the Basque country, it stands intact, like a preserved chord in a changing symphony. Shift to the maternal lines, mitochondrial DNA, passed down from mothers. The Basques share many of the same haplogroups seen across Western Europe, but their versions, their subbranches, tell a different story. Subclades like H1T1, H2A5A1, H3C2A, these aren't globally distributed. They're tucked into the folds of Basque valleys, found almost nowhere else. They split from pan-European branches thousands of years ago, then remained untouched. Their genetic dialects, spoken only in this land. Autosomal DNA, the full genomic picture, tells the same tale. When compared to other Spanish, French, or even Atlantic populations, the Basques form a sharp boundary, not because they came from somewhere else, but because others changed, and they didn't. Even regions of Spain just a few hundred kilometers away show clear signs of Roman, Moorish, and even Jewish genetic influence. But in the Basque genome, those signals vanish. They're absent. Not reduced, absent. And that absence is presence. It tells us that something profound happened here. Or rather, didn't. Language reinforced the boundary. Studies now show that areas where Euskara was spoken the longest also display the highest genetic continuity. And within Euskara itself, different dialect zones mirror subtle genetic subdivisions, like geographic fingerprints, mapped not by roads, but by marriage and memory. This is genetic microstructure at its most elegant. A people so internally bound that even neighboring towns diverge slowly, held in place by cultural inertia. And with that isolation came a paradox: clarity and cost. On one hand, the Basque genome gives us a window into prehistoric Europe clearer than any other living population. But on the other, it carries the scars of seclusion. Founder effects, endogamy, and genetic drift have amplified certain rare conditions. The same mechanisms that protected their identity also made them more vulnerable to inherited disorders. Yet even this truth doesn't make them weak. It makes them real. A reminder that purity is never simple, it carries weight. And the Basques have carried it for generations, not as a shield, but as a story. Their DNA isn't a mystery. It's a monument, not to difference, but to deliberate stillness in a world of movement. Every legacy comes with a cost. The Basques, so often admired for their genetic continuity and cultural resilience, have paid for that persistence in ways invisible to the naked eye. Beneath the stone farmhouses and mountain trails, under the pride of preserved language and ancient lineage, lives a quieter truth. Purity doesn't come without consequence. For centuries, Basque communities remained remarkably closed, not through decree, but through deep-rooted custom. Families married within their valleys. Generations repeated patterns of inheritance, kinship, and local alliance. And while this preserved their identity, it also narrowed their gene pool. Modern medical genetics has revealed the biological imprint of this seclusion. In certain Basque villages, rare hereditary diseases appear with unnerving frequency. Disorders that are virtually non-existent elsewhere in Europe show up here as silent inheritors of isolation. These aren't accidents. They are echoes, the ripple effects of generations, choosing familiar blood over foreign bonds. Blood type distribution is another example. The Basque population has one of the highest percentages of blood group A in Europe, and one of the lowest of type B. It's a subtle pattern, but one that stands apart. Like so many elements of Basque biology, it marks a long-term separation, small differences magnified by time. Even the ability to digest milk, a seemingly trivial trait, tells a deeper story. Across Europe, lactase persistence became common over the last few thousand years due to dietary shifts and migration. But among Basques, its prevalence is lower, not because they lacked access to pastoralism, but because they weren't exposed to the same genetic influx that spread the mutation elsewhere. Once again, isolation rewrote the rules. Yet these differences are not deformities. They are reminders that identity, when preserved with such intensity, shapes every level of life, from speech and ceremony down to enzymes and cells. Anthropologists once tried to define the Basques by skull shapes and cranial angles. But modern science tells a more honest tale. Genetically, the Basques fall well within the Western European continuum. They are not outliers by nature. They became distinct through choice, through pattern, through time, and in that decision to stay apart, they've become a mirror for all of us. In their DNA, we see both the beauty and the burden of continuity. In their medical records, we read the consequences of cultural cohesion carried too far. But perhaps the most striking part is this. Even with these vulnerabilities, they did not fracture. They did not dilute. They adapted, quietly, locally, in ways the outside world rarely noticed. The price of purity is real, but so is its power. Because in a world increasingly defined by change, the Basques remain a rare constant. A population whose endurance has not come cheaply, but who have paid their dues, in bloodlines, in biology, in silence, to protect something no invader could ever take.